The sea around Dragonstone was the color of iron left to rust, the night thick with the hush of old things. Salt stung the wind. Waves struck the black shore with the patience of an army that knew the castle would never move. Jon stood alone on the ramparts with his gloved hands on the damp stone and felt the watchfulness of the island, its extinct furnace cooling under his boots. The cold never bothered him. The quiet did. In quiet you heard the past. His father's voice, who was no father, the howl of ghosts of a wall he had abandoned and served and abandoned again. Through the mist, the night's rough breath, he heard Drogon from somewhere inland, a low and drowsy rumble, like a god turning in sleep. Behind him, footfalls. Ser Davos, careful not to startle, because even friends moved like enemies around a man who had fought as long as Jon had. Davos's lantern lifted a cone of amber that turned the mist into drifting wool. "She asked for you," he said. "Now? She hasn't slept, nor eaten much. I've seen men on storm-tossed decks look kinder than she does." Jon glanced up where the sky should be. There was no moon. "Tyrion, with Varys whispering over maps," Davos said, a touch of regret curling his words. "Whispers go poorly these days. I thought you should know before you go in. You think I go to her chambers to hear whispers from other men? I think you go to hear your own," Davos said, and left him with the lantern. He walked the familiar, new corridors, new to him, old to Dragonstone, with the lantern swaying, throwing his shadow up the ribs of the ceiling. He could smell the place in layers. Wet ash, old salt, the acrid tang of the braziers that burned through wind regardless. He had seen men move toward a thing as though they were falling toward it. He wondered if he had been falling since Winterfell, since he had bent the knee, since he had watched Regal dragged from the sky by iron bolts, since he had watched Missandei die between stone and sun, since Daenerys' mouth had thinned into a blade. At her door stood Grey Worm and two Unsullied whose spears would have made any other man hesitate. Grey Worm's eyes were the color of rain about to become sleet. "She asked for me," Jon said. "She did. You go alone." Grey Worm's voice could have been carved from the same stone as the doorway. Jon nodded. The Unsullied stepped aside. A soldier's courtesy. The chamber was large and empty in the way of rooms that had been lived in by lords and queens long enough to take their shape. A fire hissed in a low hearth. Light ran over the smooth curve of a dragon's head carved into the mantel. She stood at the window, her back to him, hair loose and pale as sea spray. She had always been slight, the kind of slight that made you forget she held whole peoples inside her when she spoke. The lantern found her cheek and threw it into relief, sharpening the bones. When she turned, there was something fevered in her, a night burning. In the hollows of her eyes, hunger, sleep's denial, and something harder behind that. "Jon," she said. She said his name like a question and an answer both. "You came. You sent for me," he said, and the words felt smaller than the room. She moved toward the hearth but did not sit. "I sent for you because tomorrow we take King's Landing." There was no tremor. "And I wanted you beside me, with me, not behind." "You have me," he said, then faltered. He hated the way it sounded, like a man reciting a vow that had been taught to him. He turned his face toward the fire. Shadows of flames wavered in the old stones like memories trapped there. "Doi." She studied him. "At Winterfell, the people cheered for you. They did not know me. They still do not. I crossed the world to bring freedom to those who had never had a word for it, only the ache. Here, I am a stranger knocking at a door whose hinges are older than my name." Her voice was measured, and that was worse than any storm. She had a smile that could turn iron to wax. She did not try for it now. "They will not love me," she said softly. "I saw it in their eyes. I have seen it in yours. He stopped because what he had to offer was an apology, and apologies were not for this woman and never enough. "There is a purity to this land," she said. "A purity of hate. Keeps its promises with knives. Your father died because he believed in the idea that decency could be bargained with. The city our enemies hold. I have been told of its cruelty and its hunger. I have walked its poorer streets. centuries ago in the stories of slaves, who heard the name as a place where men in red cloaks would laugh while they did what was done. "You haven't walked them," he said, because it was a graspable truth, and he needed those. "You should see them before you burn them." The sound the room made was the sound of a coal hardening. She tilted her head, surprised not by the word burn but by his fear. "The bells," she said. "Tyrion thinks bells can cleanse. Bells for surrender. A single clear note and all the city's sins drift away like smoke." She pulled her robe tighter. It was not cold and she was not shivering. "When they hear the bells, they will throw their gates open. They will kneel. And still, when I lift them, they will not love me. I have tried the language of love. Fails here. Fear does not fail." He stepped closer to her, grasping for her hands. They were warm as any human hands and as far away as stars. "There is another way," he said. Each word felt like a stone put carefully on a river's slick spine. "I know no other way," she said. She looked at him with a nakedness that was almost modest. "Show me." He moved toward her because he could not do anything else. He kissed her and tasted ash and the faint sweetness of some fruit she had eaten days ago and not forgotten. For a heartbeat, she leaned into him with a hunger that was human and simple, and there had been so little of that. Her fingers found the back of his neck. He wanted to believe in that small room of their bodies, in the quiet history written there. He wanted to save her. He wanted to save them all. Her breath broke. Into that break came the memories. A girl chained by a city's laughter. A friend's head falling from her neck while a queen watched. Dragons starved in a vault. A house of the undying whispering names. A city's gates closed again and again, and a woman looking at a throne and seeing not iron but home. He did not know all of her past, could not, but he had seen enough to understand one truth that felt like the cold does when it reaches the marrow. He could not turn her from the path she had chosen because the path had chosen her long before he met her on a snowfield under a cave of dragon glass. He pulled back. There was a pause in the room like a held breath. He could have stepped away and left and never returned, and the city would still burn under a bright afternoon. He could have said he would not ride with her, and she would have ridden without him, and the city would still burn. He could have chosen to turn away and in turning, chosen to stand with the ashes. "Forgive me," he said. He did not feel the knife leave his hand because it was not a knife. It was the sum of everything he had been made to be by a family that kept secrets and a world that made monsters of girls. He felt her breath against his face as it caught. She placed a hand on his chest, and in that touch there was honesty. The first honest touch between them because it was without hope. Her eyes widened. They were blue and then strange, and then full of some wonder that had nothing to do with him. "Oh," she said. As though she had remembered something she meant to tell him at supper. Her knees stuttered. He held her as he would have held a fallen sparrow in Winterfell's gods would, foolishly, as if gentleness could reverse what steel had done. Blood darkened her robe as gradually as a tide coming in a winter dusk. She had died before in deserts and halls. She would not rise from this. When she sagged he lowered her, and he did not know whether he was kneeling for her or to hide the sound he made. The chamber smelled suddenly of tin and wet wool. He pressed his forehead to hers, and that was worse than any pain because though she was still warm, she was already going where he could not follow. "Forgive me," he said again, and hated that he asked anything of her. The first roar did not come from his throat. It came from beyond the window, from the black curve of the night. The room trembled like a string plucked. He turned and there was Drogon, filling the window with his mouth and eye and the wet ivory of his fangs. The dragon's breath fogged the stone. A tongue the color of old wine flicked, tasted the air, tasted blood and grief and treachery, and the last thread of a bond that had tied beast and rider. Jon rose with his hands open. He had faced death so many times that its face was more familiar than his own. The eye that looked at him was larger than his head, and in it he saw himself the size of a child's toy. The dragon lowered his head into the room, neck spines brushing the lintel. The heat that came with him made the far wall weep. The dragon's nostrils widened around Daenerys's body on the floor. He made a noise then, not a roar but a sound of bewilderment, as if he had been tricked by the rules of the world. He nudged her with the flat of his snout, as gently as a horse would nuzzle an owner's hand, and when she did not stir he keened, the kind of sound Jon remembered from wolves when the pack lost its heart. Jon did not reach for his sword because there was no sword for this. The dragon lifted his head, smoke rising from the vents between his scales, and looked at Jon again with a gaze that emptied the world to two things: the man who had killed his mother and the man with whom fire had remained silent on another night. The air thickened. Jon thought of the way heat bends distance. He closed his eyes. Flame did not come. The dragon's chest swelled and held, and then the breath went out of him shuddering. Drogon's head turned, away from Jon, toward the far side of the chamber. He inhaled once and loosed a stream of fire not upon the man but upon the back wall, upon the map of Westeros spread there. Stone ran like candle wax. Paint spared none of its histories. The dragons of carved wood that adorned the far niches blackened and curled like leaves in autumn. Drogon burned until the rage was exhausted, and then he nosed his mother again, delicately, as if she had merely been sleeping in the wrong place and he meant to wake her kindly. He gathered her in his talons as a hawk gathers a hare, careful not to tear what was already torn. The great wings filled the window. For a heartbeat they took all the air in the room and the breath out of Jon's lungs. Then Drogon leapt into the night, and with him went the last of the warmth, as if a door had been shut between this world and another. When the door crashed open behind Jon, Grey Worm was first, and then unsullied in grey ripples, and at their backs Tyrion, white as the ash of a burned paper. The soldiers saw the blood first, because soldiers always did. Spears lowered. A dozen points asked the same question. Grey Worm's eyes went to the empty window where the night breathed, then to the bodiless blood. He did not shout. He did not need to. He moved like a bow that has been drawn so long there is only one release. Jon stood and did not reach for a weapon. "I did it," he said. The words landed dull, not because they lacked weight, but because they had too much. You could count the heartbeats it took for Grey Worm to cross the floor by how far the world narrowed. He stopped one arm's length away, looked at Jon as at an unmasked sickness, and raised his spear. Tyrion found his voice first. "Stop," he said, and the word wavered like a man on ice taking that last brace step. "Seresai." D to Grey Worm. "Stop." Grey Worm did not move. "He killed the dragon's mother." "Where is the dragon's mother?" Tyrion asked, and was answered by the hole where Drogon had been. His mouth closed on that. "Then she is beyond your justice," he said, "and his as well." "My queen is dead," Grey Worm said, and the words were the kind you build a life upon like stones and dirt. "And the Lannister queen lives. I will cut out one more rot before I go to her in death. You will not stop me." "You'll kill him here," Davos said quietly from the doorway. "And then you'll need to kill every Northman in the yard when they come up the stair. And when you're done with them, you'll have to kill me, because I've got old bones that still know what right is." He set himself squarely in front of Jon, as if a man with one hand and a mended jaw could be a shield against a phalanx. Jon did not ask for protection. "I will go," he said, "where you want me. Bind me if you must." Grey Worm's gaze flicked to the doorway, where the castle breathed the rising noises of a sleeping army waking to a wrongness. He gestured once. Two spears crossed at Jon's wrist. There was a roughness to it that unsullied discipline usually denied. He let them bind him. He could taste the rope fibers in the air and was grateful for them. Ropes were for the living. Tyrion was not a fool. His eyes were on the map wall, still steaming. You could see it behind his thoughts. The shape of the plan he had laid, the soft hope he'd clung to, the bells, the surrender, a city spared, a queen contained by victory's gentle law. He closed his eyes briefly. "There's no time," he said. "We must go to King's Landing at once. Without her." He had grown careful with pronouns. "Without her, the dragon is gone." Grey Worm's mouth twisted at that as if to say, "Let the world be glad for one mercy." "Tomorrow we go," he said. "We give the order we were given. The Lannister queen dies. The soldiers die. I will keep my queen's promise, even if she is not here to keep it." Tyrion looked at Jon. bound and without defense, and shook his head once as if he had swallowed something sharp. "If we attack now, the city bleeds out on both sides," he said. "And if we don't, the armies turn on one another here. The North won't let Jon be killed, and the Unsullied will die before they disobey you. We did not come to take counsel from men who traded little girls in brothels," Grey Worm said to Varys, who stood behind Tyrion with his hands folded, expressionless. "Or from men who tried to poison my queen." He did not look at Varys again. He nodded to the guards. "Put him in the lower tower. Keep him alive. Tomorrow, after the city, we judge him." Jon lowered his head, not in submission but in acknowledgement, and let the guards lead him into the castle's corridor where the torches guttered as if the air could not decide which way to go. Varys lingered once the room had emptied, the smell of smoke still raw in the throat. "You saw Drogon fly," he said. "I did," Tyrion said, and his voice was a man's voice speaking to another man, not to a lord. "He took her. If only he had taken all of our troubles with him," Varys said, cool as a pond's surface in autumn. "Letters don't burn as easily as paper. They fly faster than dragons." "You sent them," Tyrion said, not a question. "What was her name in the end?" Varys asked. "A list of titles or something smaller?" Tyrion did not answer. He looked at the place where the map had melted and wondered if fire had a memory. "We need the bells," he said. "We need to take that city without another queen slaughtered in her mind while the rest of us hold the knife. The bells are a hope men offer each other when they have nothing else," Varys said. "I will speak to those who still listen." "You will be careful," Tyrion said. "Carefulness seems a very poor currency now," Varys said, and was gone, slippered steps making less noise than a rat in an old wall. In the lower tower, the cell door sounded like a millstone grinding when it shut. Jon put his back to the damp and watched the light shapeshift on the floor as a torch outside settled. He considered praying. He had prayed in the godswood as a boy to trees that knew his father's hands and had no language for the crimes of kings. He had prayed on the wall to cold itself to strength. He had prayed on the fields to the memory of men whose names he did not know. He felt as if he had used all his prayers like a man using water in a drought on a garden that would not grow because the season had turned. The rope at his wrist scratched. He could see himself in Bran's mind, unbound, somewhere far north, and then shook it off like a snowflake melting. He breathed and let the cold of the wall settle through his leathers into the bone until he felt steadier. In the dawn gray they brought him out. The castle had gathered into war, a machine in which every lever had known its place for 500 years. The Unsullied stood marshaled in the yard with their spears like a new forest. The Dothraki moved as if someone had shaken a bucket of coals, sparks in their eyes and the quiet sigh of leather tight over muscle. Northmen stood with their mail patched and their faces set in ways only the North knew how to set them, so that even sorrow looked like a kind of weather. The wind off the sea had grown a ringed edge. The sky was a wet cloth being wrung. A horn sounded, and the sound was not a dragon's roar but the best the throat of a conch could do. Tyrion walked quickly through the lines to Davos's side, speaking low. Davos grunted once, as if he'd been struck where you strike a mule to make it mind. In the end, Grey Worm led and did not look back, because looking back was for men who doubted. He set the order and they moved, a body with too many hearts, each beating to a slightly different drum. By noon, they made the west road where the green plains ran like fresh pie, into the horizon and then wrinkled toward the walled, hungry rows of King's Landing. You could smell the city before you saw it. 1,000 cook fires and 10,000 human oils. Scorpions bristled from the walls the way porcupine quills bristle when boys make them angry with sticks. Banners hung, red and gold, the lions still bright. On the ramparts, men in crimson and leather squinted at a world that had always brought them soup and now brought them drought. They camped within sight of the walls but out of scorpion range. A parley could be arranged where the stones met the dirt. Tyrion insisted on going. Grey Worm would not go to speak when he wanted to go to cut. Jon, under guard, was led as far as the boundary of the shade of a single lonely tree and left where he could watch but not be watched as a commander. Varys disappeared as ink sinks into water. Davos walked the perimeter with the weary grace of a man who has learned to be loved by sailors and mistrusted by lords and finds both reactions sensible. "Who will they send?" Davos asked. "Qyburn," Tyrion said, as if naming a kind of disease. "Who else can speak for a woman who's forgotten how to listen?" It was Qyburn, austere as a monk, with his little book and the expression of a man curating a collection of curiosities that smelled faintly of embalming herbs. Behind him stood Ser Gregor Clegane in armor that made him a tower, and a clutch of gold cloaks whose only courage had been sewn into their tunics by mothers. Tyrion went forward with Davos at his shoulder and with one glance back, as a man might glance at a house that had stood all his life before he left it a final time. "You know why we're here," Tyrion said. "We don't need to decorate it." Qyburn's smile did not reach his eyes and seemed to be an artifact from an earlier life. "I know why you think you are. Have the bells ready," Tyrion said. "When your queen yields, the city is spared." "And if my queen does not yield," Qyburn said, "your armies will starve at our gates until they rot. The city is old. It remembers sieges. It has never loved any army outside its walls enough to let them pass appetite's test." "Your queen is pregnant," Tyrion said. "I know my sister. She will try to carry that child through fire if she must. But it can be otherwise. We can give her a cradle, not a funeral bier." He looked up at the walls as though he could see through stone to where, in some upper chamber, a woman stood looking out at history being set with her name. "Tell her that her brothers have come to take her down, not like a stag to market, but like a lady gently escorted to the carriage waiting in the yard." Qyburn's mouth thinned, which was perhaps what passed for amusement in him. "Your brother is in chains," he said, "or will be soon. My queen expects it. Brothers cannot help themselves." Tyrion did not flinch. "Then pity me, my foolish love, and imagine I might pity yours." "The scorpions are primed," Qyburn said. "Your dragon is gone. We saw it fall into the sea days ago." He studied Tyrion carefully, noting what twitched and what did not. "How odd that you would still come." "We came because there are more ways to win than to kill," Tyrion said. "It is a lesson that your queen has never learned." Qyburn inclined his head as if he had been corrected in a grammar and was grateful for it. He turned and walked away, as if he had come not as an emissary but as a man measuring the length of a hall he meant to build. "What did we gain?" Davos asked. "A bit of time," Tyrion said. "Perhaps 3 bells worth." "Bells again," Davos said. "You've a piety about them." "I have a piety about children who aren't roasted on their supper tables." "Yes?" Tyrion said, and wiped his brow, though the day was not hot. "We need Jaime. If he's within the city, he'll go to her, and perhaps he can bring her down." "Jaime Lannister to save the city from Cersei Lannister," Davos said. "That's a song with a sour ending." "It's the songs with sour endings that are true," Tyrion said. He looked over his shoulder at the tree where Jon sat bound and straight. "And sometimes the ones with no ending at all." That night, Varys's little birds moved through the camp and through the city, invisible arteries. Men on the walls began to talk to each other in shorter, quicker words. Somewhere in the city, a pair of bells sounded the hour and were answered by another pair further off, as if 2 old women were telling each other the same story to see if their versions matched. Jaime did come to the city, wearing the wrong cloak poorly and holding the wrong hand nobly. He was caught and then set free again by the shorter brother who loved him more than wine. Tyrion put his face into Jaime's chest where his hand would not be felt and said, "Bring her out under a flag. There are men here who will fire regardless. But there might be enough who will wait for a bell if they hear it. Tell her it is for her child." "My child," Jaime said, without bitterness or claim. "All right." He kissed his brother's forehead like a blessing preceding a sacrifice and went into the city that had made and unmade them both. At dawn, the armies advanced just close enough for the archers to test each other's patience and find that patience was the only thing longer than fear. Tyrion, gambling with a dice cup no one could see, sent Davos with a handful of quick-footed men to the eastern river gate. Arya and the Hound had already slipped in under the cover of night. Sandor looked at the city as a dog looks at a field in which he lost a fight and wants it back. Arya looked as a girl looks at the last name on her list. On the wall above the gate, a boy no older than Jon had been when he first climbed the wall leaned too far as he tried to see what heroism looked like and caught sight instead of a pair of eyes that had learned to see in winter. Arya mouthed one word to him, "Bells," and he nodded as a child nods to his sister when he tells him to hush because father is drunk. She moved like a warm shadow through staircases and courtyards where hammers rang on bolts and the smell of oil lay heavy as thunderclouds. The hound moved not like a shadow but like a storm that was trying to behave. When they reached the inner gatehouse, 2 gold cloaks fell asleep after a long night and never woke. Arya's hands were clean when she lifted them, but only because she had learned to do what she did without splashing. In the Red Keep, Cersei stood in a high chamber smelling of oranges and lilies and a faint medicinal that she did not ask about. Below her, the city waited the way a body waits on an operating table for the surgeon to choose a knife. Qyburn stood behind her with his hands folded and his eyes on an entirely different object in his mind's theater. Euron Greyjoy was not there. He was on the quay with a sword he thought had luck sewn into the hilt, watching the sea for monsters he had already met. She touched her belly. It had not changed as much as she'd hoped. Hope was a game she had learned to cheat at. When the bells rang the first time that morning, it was because a boy had found his way up a staircase that was older than his grandfather's house and pulled a rope with all his small weight. The tone was thin and frightened. It surprised the city into a silence that was merely a different kind of noise. The gold cloaks on the inner walls looked at one another. The first archers lowered their bows. On the outer wall, the scorpions stood ready, and the old men who had been rewarded with their charge thought of the dragons they had never seen. The second bell came from the far side of the city with more authority, because the ringer had arms that had built boats and hauled nets. Then a third. Somewhere, a woman called for her child as if she were calling him for supper. In the camp, men who had been told to charge when the gate opened now discovered that the sound of bells had a power to unbend knees. They had been told a story. Bells meant surrender, meant a city unmaking its fist. Tyrion's face changed so subtly you would have needed to have loved him to see it. Grey Worm did not change at all. "Now," Tyrion said, breathless despite himself. "The gates." The river gate yawned like a mouth that had lost a tooth. The first free city's sun slid along the river and into the eyes of men who had never loved beauty. Davos ran under that light, his men close and properly afraid, and met a knot of gold cloaks who had decided to pretend the bells meant surrender even if no one had told them officially yet. There was a dance made of confusion and relief, and then a shouting when the Unsullied reached the gate at a run, their spears snapping into alignment like a sound you feel in your bones. Jon, still bound, moved toward the front because men who had followed him would see him and men who had hated him would see him, and both might hesitate at killing each other as long as he was unsure. 2 Unsullied held him, hands like iron. Grey Worm advanced with the first line, and you could feel the moment when his men expected to hear an old command in a voice that would not ever come again. Instead, the world offered them bells and their own leader's grief. On the steps of the Red Keep, the mountain stood a little behind Qyburn like a clot at the end of a vein. Jaime climbed the last of 1,000 steps with blood running down his side and his face set in that calm he wore when things were irretrievable. A gold cloak reached to help him until he recognized the face and then withdrew his hand as a subject withdraws an exaggeration before a king. "I have to see her," Jaime said, and the man found that the habit of obeying men whose sisters could kill him was stronger than the habit of guarding doors. By the gatehouse, the hound paused. He knew the place. He had been a boy here once with his face still in one piece. He could smell the old fires off his own old skin. It made him thoughtful for a heartbeat. He knew where his brother would be, if his brother could still be described by place and not simply as a direction to fall. Arya touched his arm. "After," she said. "There's no after," Sandor said. "Not for me, girl." He looked at her properly. "There might be for you. Drop it." She had a vision of a queen with a crown hair-braided over a skull's thoughts. She had saved a few people in this city once, and she had watched many more die. She thought of a girl running through alleys with a loaf of hot bread when it was worth your life to run. She thought of a door closing. She tasted metal at the back of her throat, put there not by blood but by choice, and nodded. They parted without more words. The hound's boots rang on the steps as he went toward the great man who had made him a story. Arya went toward the bell tower because bells were the only magic in the city today that did not wear a face. On the quay, Euron found Jaime because the world enjoys a small symmetry. He laughed with delight, because any meeting can be a party if you are mad enough. They fought with the enthusiasm of men who know they have already lost their best love. Euron was faster. Jaime was better. Euron's blade bit into Jaime's side, Jaime's into Euron's chest. At the end, Euron sank back against a bollard and grinned as if he had finally bedded the sea itself. "I got the Kingslayer," he said to no one. Jaime limped away because loving a woman had broken his life and he did not know how to stop loving. On the steps of the Red Keep, Tyrion went as far as he dared and then farther, because some things feel proper when you are doing them and like madness only in recollection. "Cersei!" he shouted. "Cersei, it doesn't have to be like this." Qyburn moved to gesture, and the mountain moved one step, and a small man with no weapon made a whole army hold its breath. "The bells," he said again, and someone in the city who had not rung one yet found that he had to very badly and did. The sound poured into courtyards and sprang over roofs. It reached the Red Keep and entered the queen's throat. She wet her lips. There was a moment when you could have believed in the young woman who had married Robert Baratheon with a crown in her heart because she had not known how much it would weigh. She put a hand to her belly, and it was as if all the crimes she had done tried to climb up her arm to reach it and were weary. Jaime reached her then, blood wet and bright with it. He took her hand. "It's over," he said, and something in her, some organ older than lying, recognized the truth when it was bitten. Her chin lifted as if she sensed a scaffold. "I will surrender," she said. Qyburn's mouth opened. "Your Grace." He did not have time to counsel because the mountain moved his head a fraction and Qyburn realized something then that did not show on his face, that his creature did not go where he pointed anymore. It went where the gravity of long hatred pulled. He took a step back and then another and then stopped because dignity had always been a friend of his, even now. Below, the Unsullied had taken the lower streets. The Dothraki hungered and held their horses with difficulty, because bells were not their language. Northmen looked to Jon and saw his hands bound and forgot the parts of them that loved order and remembered the parts that loved him. Davos did a thing he had done before in storms. He shouted louder than other men and his voice became the thing to hold on to. "Hold!" he called. "Hold! Damn your eyes! If you strike now, your grandchildren will wish wolves had eaten you." Grey Worm stood with his spear level and his jaw set. He could not hear Davos above the bell's long hum and his own heart's single syllable. "Kill." Missandei's last word rang in him. He saw Lannister soldiers dropping their swords, hands lifted. Tyrion grabbed his sleeve as one might grab the rein of a charging horse, knowing the teeth might follow. "Stop," Tyrion said, and at last said Grey Worm's name, the one Missandei had spoken with that upward lilt that had made it soft. "Torgo Nudo. Stop." Grey Worm's gaze sliced to him. 1,000 days of discipline leaned their weight onto one breath. Slowly, like a fever that had broken, the spear dropped a finger's width, and then another. From the towers, white handkerchiefs appeared as if the city had suddenly taken up laundry. Gates opened like lips to be kissed or bitten. Tyrion exhaled something he had been holding since he was a boy brought in chains to this place to be gawked at. In the throne room, Cersei went out under a white flag with Jaime on her arm and Qyburn 6 paces behind. The mountain followed because the only leash he understood was proximity to his power. The city watched the queen of its worst and longest habits descend the steps and go to meet the strange army. The people had never seen a queen surrender and did not know what faces to make. Some tried smiles and found them too complicated for the muscles of their cheeks. Some cried because their bodies finally believed they could. She stopped 2 spear lengths from Grey Worm. Tyrion stepped forward because languages were needed that spears did not speak. "You yield?" he asked in a voice that had announced spectacles to crowds once upon a time. "I do," she said. And the words were the first true words she'd spoken in years, in that they meant something other than what they said. "For my child." Grey Worm's face might as well have been carved out of salt. "And for the girl you killed," he said, and that was not a question. It was a death sentence spoken so softly that it might pass for gossip until the Reaper came. Cersei's blink was a butterfly's. She was not given to apologies. She measured Grey Worm and found she did not care what units she used. "For the city," she said, correcting, which is what queens do when the world says anything at all. Jon came through the press with his guards, and when Northmen saw him they did not reach for their swords but for a kind of breath that they had meant to use in joy for once. He looked at Cersei and saw not a monster but a woman in a dress whose threads had been woven by fingers like other fingers. He looked at Grey Worm and saw a man who had lost his language when a girl's voice was cut short. He looked at Tyrion, who had bet the small remainder of his soul on bells, and at Davos, who had patched so many holes in so many boats and wondered how many more fingers the old man had left. Tyrion said, "We accept your surrender." The word we hung like a fragile bridge. "For whom do you accept it?" Cersei asked, her chin high, her mouth daring truth to come and be kissed. "There is no queen." Tyrion looked at Jon and then at the men. He felt Varys close by though he could not see him. He felt the eyes of an entire land hungry for an answer that would allow them to sleep without fire in their beds. He had a dozen answers. He chose the one he could endure without drink. "For the realm," he said, "and until a new ruler is chosen by a council of the great houses." Cersei's mouth twitched. She had never imagined she would be taken down by procedures. "Very well," she said. "I would rather be judged by lords and ladies whose excuses are at least polished." Jaime's hand tightened on hers. He looked at Jon and at the rope on his wrists and frowned, recognizing a man who had done something heavy and was paying for it. "Take her into custody," Tyrion said. "No chance." He added that for Jaime. Grey Worm's spear came up, then down, then up, as if something in him was broken and the movement was the way it rattled. He stepped back and gave a small motion with his chin. An Unsullied turned and put out a hand, and Cersei, after a long moment where the world watched to see if she would strike it away, placed her hand in his. The city exhaled. It was a sound like the sea suddenly finding itself out of wind. The bell slowed and stopped, leaving an echo that would cling to the corners of rooms. The first day of the peace was not peaceful. There were arguments that sounded like wars on this corner, and that the Dothraki had to be kept out of taverns with the promise of twice the women they would find elsewhere. Northmen, who could not celebrate without fighting and could not fight without remembering they were the wrong men to be throwing cups at, got into brawls with men who wore red and quietly forgot what their banners had looked like that morning. Davos paced 3/4 of the city and put out more fires than a dragon had in his life. Tyrion found that the only thing powerful enough to halt one river of blood was another, slow, stubborn river of diplomacy that began in 1,000 corners and flowed toward the same mouth. He slept not at all. Jon slept because they let him, which was one more mercy he did not think he deserved. In the night he dreamed of Drogon flying not east but north, over a wall that had been a spine, over forests he knew, carrying a body that bled into snow and stained it like a banner. In the morning he woke with salt in his mouth that might have been tears or sea or blood. The guards brought him bread and fish with their eyes averted, not out of disdain but out of a piety to the dead. Grey Worm came to him before noon. He dismissed the guards and stood in the doorway as if he supervising his own execution. "You killed her," he said. "I did," Jon said. He did not add why or when or with what. Words felt like another kind of bid for mercy. Why? Because Varys's letters would fly. Because the city would burn. Because the girl a world had made would not turn from the only way it had taught her. Because mercy did not belong to kings and queens. Because he could not let her become what she had sworn to end. Because he loved her. To save them, he said, and found it was the only one among his reasons he could bear to speak. Grey Worm's jaw worked once. "I would have burned the city gladly," he said. "For her. So would they." He jerked his chin toward where the yard lay hot and full of spear shadow. What you saved is not mine. That is true, Jon said. He met Grey Worm's eyes, which was like staring at an old wound and not looking away. I cannot ask you to forgive me. I would not forgive me. Grey Worm was quiet long enough that the torch burned down a finger's width. Noth, he said finally. Jon blinked, slow as a man surfacing. Missandei's Island. It is a place where there are no masters, Grey Worm said. The people there know only one kind of fighting. They fight sickness. They do not understand our ways. He looked down at his hand. He had never allowed his hands to show how he felt. It betrayed him now. I will take my men there. We are not meant for peace. But perhaps we will learn. Or perhaps we will die and then I will see her. Jon knew enough to understand grace when it came in someone else's language. He nodded. It is a good place. Grey Worm took a step into the cell. There will be a council. If they decide for you, if they decide you live, I will accept. If they decide you die, I will accept. But I will not allow your North to take your life from us. They are eager to forgive you because they need you. Forgiveness given because it is needed is not forgiveness. It is barter. I don't own the North, Jon said. They will do what they do. They look at you and know what to do, Grey Worm said, and turned and left. And for the first time Jon felt a stirring of gratitude toward the man that did not have to pass through pain. The council took place in the dragon pit because it was a place meant for dangerous majesty rendered safe. The broken ring of it opened to sky, half amphitheater, half wound. Lords and ladies collected there like birds drawn to the same tree by the last fruit. Jon Royce of the Vale, stone-carved. Yara Greyjoy, smelling of tar and insult. Edmure Tully, taller when he talked than when he listened. Gendry, awkward in a lord's boots that still felt like someone else's feet were in them. Samwell Tarly, with too much bookish hope for a single body. Brienne of Tarth, wearing her honor like a second spine. Ser Bronn arrived late with the amusement of a man who could not believe a joke had lasted this long. Sansa came in a dress the color of Winterfell under a cloudy morning. Her hair braided in meanings that the South had never learned to read. Arya sat very still and watched everyone as if they were all ravens arriving to peck at the same carcass. Davos kept his hands in his sleeves as if he were cold and was not. Varys did not sit but flowed from one edge of the gathering to another, not speaking, as if being in the presence of all these choices was the closest thing to a home he would find. They brought Jon up under guard and sat him where he could see the sky and not pretend it was a roof. Tyrion stood in the center and turned like a man slowly in a room to make sure the walls were all still there. We have a city, Tyrion said. We have an army. We have another army. We have a queen in custody and we have Jon Snow. He let the murmur run along the benches like a mouse. We have, for the first time in a very long time, a chance for something that does not begin and end with heads on spikes. That is judged by this council, and the sentence, whatever it is carried out fairly and finally. No wildfire, no crossbows, no leons, just the law. And the law is what now? Jon Royce asked, because he was a man who liked his laws to sit still, and in recent months they had not. The law is what we make it, Sam said, flushing. We could choose a ruler who would use the law to make more law. He faltered when he saw the smiles, except for Tyrion's, which was sad for him. And we could decide who chooses the ruler. Everyone could choose. Everyone, Royce said, as if he were being offered a pie baked partly with shoe leather. You want to give my stable boy a say in who sits the Iron Throne? He might pick better, Arya said. Tyrion held up his hands. Let the people choose who cleans their streets before we ask them to choose who commands their armies. Today we decide among ourselves, and if we can manage not to kill each other in the process, we can call it progress. He turned toward Jon. The truest heir by paper and whisper is Aegon of House Targaryen, he said, and watched Jon take that and hate it with a familiar grief. He doesn't want it. He killed the last Targaryen monarch, Yara said, bristling. Or queen, if you prefer the word. She looked at Grey Worm sitting alone on a bench as if the space around him had decided to respect him by being empty. I understand the offense. He killed her to save the city, Davos said. That is a thing he says, Yara replied. I have heard men say they cut rope to save ships and then watched ships sink. He killed her because he knew she would burn them all, Sansa said, and her voice could have frozen water. My sister was in that city. So were children. So were old men who have little to give this world besides their memories. He killed her because we have been ruled by men and women whose love for power is only matched by their love for vengeance. If you want an honest account, I will give it to you. He had loved her. He did it anyway. She did not take her eyes off Yara until the Ironborn looked away, not with shame but with the recognition of a blade she could respect. Then what? Royce asked. If not him. Tyrion took a breath the depth of a decade. The Lord who knows the If you have the North as a kingdom apart, who would you rather see in the South than a boy you love who wants nothing? Bran looked at Jon with a gaze that had no weight and all the weight in the world. Jon thought of nights by a fire with the boy sleeping under his cloak and the sound of wind in that wild backyard of their childhood. He thought of ravens and the beach of faces. He nodded, and it felt not like surrender, but like putting a stone where you know a wall will stand better. Yes, Jon said. Everyone heard it without him raising his voice. There was a murmur that turned itself into words. Jon Royce said he would follow the council. Yara wrinkled her nose as if the smell of the idea had changed and then shrugged because she had never cared much for crowns that were not made of iron and rust. Edmure stood up and began to explain why he would make an excellent king. And Sansa sat him back down with the quiet power of a woman who had learned to do it without hurting those she loved. Bronn asked if he could be master of coin, and everyone laughed until they saw he was serious and then decided the kingdom had survived worse. Sam smiled in a way that meant he had put something right in his head. Grey Worm lifted his hand. He had not spoken. He did now, and when he did, men stopped adjusting their cloaks. If you choose this boy, he said, and you let the North be free, what of the man who killed my queen? Do I take his head to Noth as a gift? Or do I take his life with me as a debt kept? Tyrion had known this would come and had not found a way to like any of the answers. He looked at Jon, and Jon shook his head very slightly. Don't. The Night's Watch still exists, Tyrion said, ignoring the knowing smiles. Let him take the black again. Let him be what he was made to be. No wife, no children, no throne, no songs. A life for a life turned into labor. It is a joke the gods have always loved. He did not look at Grey Worm when he said it because he could not. Sansa's eyes softened, and then hardened, like a cloud shadow passing over a stone. Arya's mouth pressed flat. Davos closed his eyes and saw snow in summer. Grey Worm considered. A soldier knows what to do with a sentence that fits into a category he understands. If this council decrees it, he said, I accept. I take my men to Noth. We will not return. Then, Tyrion said, lifting his hands, Bran the Broken, will you rule? Bran looked around, and if he felt any sorrow at the world's need of him again, he did not show it. Why do you think I came all this way? He said, and the smallest, most human smile moved the corners of his mouth. Mischief that belonged to a boy who had climbed too high in a courtyard. I accept. The hall exhaled in a way different from the city's exhale. Less desperate, more bewildered. They had done something without a war storm. Felt unsteady. Felt possible. They judged Cersei that afternoon. She stood without a crown and without a man at her side for the first time anyone could. Remember, Jaime watched from a bench with a bandage on his side and a face scrubbed of everything but expectancy, which is a cousin to love. The charges were a list long enough to make even those who hated her tired. She did not apologize. She did not confess. She looked at Bran for a long time, as if this thin, distant boy in a chair could give her a thing none of the men in her life had given, and smiled a little. You do not hate me, she said, curious. Bran shook his head slightly. I have no room, he said. I am full of the world. They sentenced her to life in a tower near where she had once kept another woman. Sansa chose it. Let her see the city she made, Sansa said. Let the bells ring in a way she cannot command. Jaime went with her, Brienne went to him once afterward and left with a kindness in her face that she folded carefully away, for use later. Grey worms sailed within the week. The unsullied ships looked clean cutting the green sea. They did not sing. Men on the quays raised hands without words. Davos stood with Tyrion watching them until the last sail was a comma and then blankness. "There goes the best army I ever saw," Davos said. "With the worst luck." "Luck is the poor word we use when we can't say we did what we could," Tyrion said, and then blinked at himself. "Gods, that sounded like something my father would have said. If you ever catch me polishing cups in a bad mood, kill me." "Gladly," Davos said, which was what friends say when murder is impossible. Yara gathered her ships and took her people back to their kelp and wind, promising to raid less and then laughing. Gendry went to Storm's End and stood in the great round hall where he had never been before and said his own name, which still tasted strange on his tongue. Edmure went home and found that rivers had a way of forgiving their sons as long as they stayed within their banks. Royce returned to the Eyrie and told his lady how the South had behaved, and she nodded and thought of Snow. Sam wrote letters that almost no one read and built a school under a tree that used to be a gallows. Bronn took the Master of Coin and discovered that money had more kinds than he'd known. Some of it was even good. Sansa stood under Winterfell's gray sky and was crowned with a circlet that had been hammered by men who had never held such a small thing with such care. The North bent its knee to her because pride can be a gentle thing in the right hands. Arya watched, then kissed her sister's cheek and said, "I can stay." And Sansa said, "No, you can go." And that was the greatest love in a single sentence either of them had spoken, so Arya went. She stood on the prow of a small ship and let the spray salt her face and thought that the maps were liars because blankness was never blank. Tyrion became hand because someone had to be. He sat in a freshly cleaned room that seemed suspiciously the same as the one in which he had first learned to frown over a parchment, and he tried to make jokes at meetings and failed and then made a few that landed. He found that Bran did not need him to tell him what happened in the far corners. He needed him to tell him what men felt when it happened. It was harder work than any he'd ever done. And Jon rode north. Men tried to throw feasts in his path, and he found reasonable and unreasonable ways to avoid them. He stopped at the ruins of the great hearth in the castle where he had been small and saw himself as a boy walking with a wooden sword because it had been the only gift that made sense. He visited a godswood where he could still feel Ned's hand resting on his head like patience. He said nothing to the tree because the tree knew. At the wall, he found fewer men than there had been and more crows, as if the birds had come to make up numbers. The wall had a scar that would never heal and looked better for it, like an old man's face with one good laugh line. He found Tormund waiting, sitting on a stone and picking his teeth with a piece of splinter that might once have been part of the realm's last defense. Ghost came out of the trees like a piece of them and went to Jon with all the dignity of a lord and all the joy of a dog who has simply been waiting for his person to come home. "You brought the long-faced one back," Tormund said. "I thought you'd go south and learn to wear soft boots." "I tried," Jon said. "You always were bad at learning," Tormund replied with affection. He looked at the wall as if it were a stubborn woman. "Come on. The true north's up here. Maybe we'll find a place where the wind doesn't use our bones as flutes." They went beyond the wall one morning with their packs and enough food and a confidence that had nothing to do with safety. The world widened until even regret had trouble keeping up. In flats where the ground looked wet and was only green, he saw her once. No, that was a girl with hair like fire who was not the one he had loved. In a stand of frozen birch, he felt a shadow pass over him and looked up and caught a tremor in the clouds that might have been a dragon if the world had chosen to allow such fanciful kindness. He did not call out. He dreamed often of the chamber on Dragonstone, and sometimes he woke with his face wet because dream salt tastes like sea salt when you have seen as much of both as he had. He began to talk to her in his head as one speaks to the dead. Casually, as if the great weight of absence were just another thing to carry on a good road. He told her about fish that bite and rivers that pretend to be deeper than they are, about the smell of pine sap, about the way he had seen a child in a village with eyes so dark they looked like stones in water laughing at a stick as if it were the only toy the world needed. He told her of Ghost nosing into drifts and coming up looking like a pie. He did not tell her he was sorry because he had learned that sorry is a word for the living, and she had gone where words go to change. In the south, the city made a habit of not burning. Bells rang for weddings, for births, for the day when Cersei's hand was seen at a window holding a cup of wine she had not poisoned. Jaime walked the walls sometimes, his hand against the old stone, and learned the names of the guards without flirting with their wives. Brienne came once a year and never stayed long, because she found staying was still a battlefield. Bran listened to men argue about the price of wheat and the width of roads and found it as glorious as any saga. Tyrion discovered that he liked the way the city smelled when it rained, which was more honest than it was in heat. Grey Worm's men learned a new rhythm. They walked the beaches of Noth at dusk because the insects that haunted the island's interior did not trouble the shore. They watched butterflies the size of a man's palm land on Franz Green as young hope. They buried their dead without swords. Sometimes, when the wind came off the little forests, it smelled of something sweet, and sometimes it smelled like nothing at all, which was best. Grey Worm stood at the edge of the water, sometimes with his feet just in, and when he closed his eyes he could almost hear the bells of a city ring out a surrender that had been a miracle. And sometimes he opened them and saw her walking toward him along the line where water keeps kneeling, and he knew the trick his mind played and let it play, because men are not made to fight themselves forever. One winter night, far later than even the maesters would have predicted, wolves howled north of the wall, and Jon felt the skin of the world go tight with fear of something that was not coming. He sat up and saw the sky's blank color and understood that he had grown used to the peace of ordinary threats. He smiled at that peace because he had always thought it would look like a banner and a crown. It looked like a stew that did not burn and boots that kept your feet dry and a woman at a market yelling at a baker because his bread was light on flour. It looked like sleeping through a night without dreams and sometimes like waking with them and not minding. He would never be free of what he had done. He would live in a world that had been pulled from a fire just before the beam fell and knew the smell on its clothes. That would be enough. In the mornings, he would walk out with Tormund and Piss beside him and say nothing and let the steam rise and watch the sun come up on a land that kept making itself even when no one told it to. On good days, he would call Ghost with a whistle and the wolf would run to him across the snow, light as a thought. On bad days, he would sit and watch the horizon until it widened again. Somewhere, a dragon flew east over a black desert and west over a faint green hill and north over ice that cracked under his shadow. He carried a memory of a woman's hand on his nose and a man who did not burn and could not forgive himself. He would not return to the city with the bells. He was too old for it now. He would fly until flying was the only story he knew, and when he landed at last, it would be in a place with no words. Those who live with fire learn to love silence. The realm did not become kind. It became itself.
Men cheated at dice.
Women lied to lovers for good reasons. Children learned to count. Winter came and went and came again. It was a world that remembered the shape of a woman who had believed she could be the mother of it and had been wrong and had been more than wrong. It was a world that remembered that a man had killed that woman to save it and had saved only what could be saved. It was enough. It had to be. On a morning in the far north when the air tasted of new snow, Jon stood at the edge of a stand of spruce that sang softly in a wind that had come a long way. Tormund was behind him complaining about his knees. Ghost stood in the shade with his tongue lolling, pretending he did not care about squirrels. The sky was gray and silver and a little like the inside of a shell. Jon felt the quiet with his whole body, and for once it did not make him afraid. He thought he could hear bells very far away, and then he knew he was hearing nothing at all, which was its own kind of music. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he took one step forward into the trees, and the branches closed around him with the sound of a hand passing through tall grass. The path lay ahead, narrow and unowned. He followed it. Behind him, his footprints filled with blown snow and were gone. Ahead, the world kept on, which is what the world does when it can. And somewhere, in a city by the sea, people woke and fought and loved and rang bells when it was time, and somewhere, in a house with a wheel on its sign, a girl sat and wrote a story in a neat small hand and thought of wolves. And sometimes, in the middle of a day that had done nothing to deserve it, he would feel a warmth in his chest like a hand, and it would pass, and he would breathe, and the air would smell clean, and that would be all. Sandor Clegane found his brother under the Red Keep where the light did not reach but remembered it had been there once. Stones sweated in the damp and the smell was cellar stale, wine and old blood and the secrets of kings. The mountain stood in the middle of a passage wide enough for half a dozen men to ride abreast. His plate the color of morning iron, his helm a blank like an erased face. He faced no one at all, as if he had been set there to guard nothing but the idea of standing. Qyburn's footsteps scraped up behind, his breath already short from fear or poor lungs. "Ser Gregor," Qyburn said, soft as a hand over a child's eyes. "Come." The mountain did not move. He had not moved since the bells began. Perhaps the bells had found his one remaining nerve and wrung it until it snapped. Sandor stopped 3 paces away and loosened his sword, such as it was, in its sheath. He had not cared for his blade since. He'd left the Queen's service. A sword is a habit when you're young and a burden when you get old. To Sandor it had become both. "You know me," he said. No answer. The great helm turned a fraction. The gap in the visor leaked nothing of a man. "You know me?" Sandor said again, and then said his brother's name, the one that had once belonged to a boy who had thrown a toy into a fire because he'd grown bored of it. "Gregor." Qyburn saw the tilt of the helm and pressed forward, relief making him rash. "Sir, obey." "To the Queen." He raised a gloved hand to touch an elbow whose circumference could have served as a man's thigh. The mountain turned his head with a slow disgust, as if Qyburn's voice were a fly whining inside the closed place where memory used to be. The glove brushed the steel and the mountain's arm moved without visible effort. Qyburn's feet left the floor. He made a small sound, embarrassed, more than afraid, and struck the wall at such speed that the dim lantern shook. There was a wet crack that did not echo, because the walls were kind enough to keep it close. Qyburn slid down and did not speak again. "Good," Sandor said. It was not for the death. Qyburn left no ledger of debt in Sandor's heart, but for the way the mountain had done it without looking. That told Sandor what part of his brother remained, the part that had been most true. Sandor did not hate Qyburn. He did not love him. He did not care for him. He cared for this. A clean fight, which was a foolish thing to expect in a cellar of a palace where nothing had ever been clean. But he had always kept one foolishness, the way some men kept one spoon from childhood. The mountain lifted his sword, a broad, brutal thing with a nicked edge and dried arcs of brown that had never been wiped properly. Sandor breathed out, the breath a coin he paid to buy himself a smaller world where only the step and the angle mattered. He moved first because he had learned as a boy that waiting only made his brother bigger. The first ring of steel shuddered through the corridor. Sparks kept their secrets and fell quickly. Sandor stepped sideways and let the next stroke glance off his guard. The mountain hit like a door slamming in a gale. Sandor's shoulder hummed with the force of it. He took the leverage, rolled under, and came up inside, close enough to smell the leather's rot and the faint medicinal reek that clung to the armor like a perfume that had overstayed its welcome. He drove his pommel up, aiming where a nose might be if there were a face. The helm rattled. The mountain did not flinch. A mailed hand like a smith's clamp found Sandor's shoulder and squeezed until something lit behind his eyes. He broke away, breath sawing now, laughing because pain made Homeric things simple. "You always were ugly," Sandor said. "They did you no favors, making you worse." The mountain came on, relentless, and the fight found its own rhythm. Step, strike, yield a half pace, cut, duck, curse, bleed. Men, drawn by the sound, gathered at the edges of the corridor and then drew back again when a sweep of the mountain's blade bit into the stone and sent chips stinging like wasps. No one shouted commands. There are some fights that belong to the fighters, and even soldiers can know when to let the gods watch. "Sandor," a voice said once, cautious, as if it were not certain it had the right to speak his name. He did not look. If he looked, he would see Arya, and he could not carry that into this. He kept his head down and his blade up and his heart in the narrow place it liked. The mountain changed the angle of his swing by a finger's breadth, and Sandor felt the change through his wrist and let it carry his blade high rather than low. The sword screamed past his thigh and took a strip from his hauberk. Skin opened. Heat followed. He leaned into the next beat and cut at the straps that bound plate to man. He had done this before. He had unmade knights in their tin with careful cuts. The mountain straps were thick and stiff and filthy. His edge bit and skipped. Blood wet the leather and served as oil. The strap yielded. The pauldron loosened and hung like a petulant child tugging at a mother's skirt. "Come on then," Sandor said, and spat blood. "Come on, you great." He did not waste the breath on the name. He let it out as effort, as swing. The mountain's next blow hammered his blade down, and his knee went with it. And for a heartbeat Sandor was kneeling, not in prayer but because gravity had reminded him that it always wins. His brother raised his sword for the old familiar head chop, and Sandor rolled, taking along with him the shame of a boy crawling away from a fire. The blade rang on stone. Chips stung like stars in his face. He came up inside again, close as a lover, and drove his dagger up between gorget and helm with a snarl old as their father's house. The dagger found a seam. It might as well have found a tree. The force of it stabbed his hand more surely than it stabbed the thing inside the armor. He felt something give, a soft give like rotten fruit, but if his brother felt it, he did not show it. A gauntlet the size of a ham found Sandor's forearm and squeezed. Fingers dug in. Bones complained and then radiated their complaint up the arm to the shoulder, and Sandor heard himself growl because a man is not himself entirely when another man is trying to make him into paste. "Burn," he said, and surprised himself, because he had not meant to say it aloud. He drove his head forward, took the helm with his brow, saw a flash of light that was not in the corridor, and bit down on the inside of his cheek to keep his feet connected to himself. He stepped back all at once and pulled. The dagger came free with a sound he did not care to hear again. Blood, black, thick like oil, coated the blade. It did not steam in the cold of these stones. It did not look like anything a man should have in him. "The maester's work," he said, his voice hoa. "Arasi, they made you a barrel to carry poison." The mountain swung. Sandor took it where he had no choice. On his left forearm, bone on iron, iron on flesh. The world cracked, and he felt that crack from wrist to jaw. His sword fell. He did not remember losing it. One heartbeat it was in his hand, the next it was metal on the floor, a ringing thing going where he could not reach. He went for it, but the mountain's boot found his chest and pinned him like a beetle. "Do it, then," Sandor said. His voice carried easily in the corridor's shape and sounded to him like another man's, older by years he had not earned. "Finish it. Make it simple." The mountain raised his sword. In the corner of Sandor's eye, a lantern guttered and flamed and made a small gesture of brightness. The flame was the size of a man's thumb, and he felt his throat close around a boy's scream. He forced his eyes to the iron above him. He had come for this. He would not go anywhere else. The sword did not fall straight. The mountain's boot shifted, weight seeking purchase on the greased stone, and in that fraction Sandor twisted. The blade came down and bit his shoulder instead of his throat. The heat of it ran into his chest. He tasted metal that was not blood. It was the taste of a smithy in the back of his teeth. He shoved, a fool's shove, and the shove worked because even a mountain loses its balance when the ground under it is slick with old wine and men's sweat. He slid, rolled, and found himself with his hand on the hilt of his fallen sword as if a kindly god had set it there for him. He rose with a noise like a cart being pulled out of mud, and as he rose he cut. The blade went in under the loosened pauldron, through leather, through rings, through cloth, into meat. It stuttered on the far side and stopped, caught on bone. The mountain's body jerked, not like a man startled, but like a thing prodded. He turned and came on. Sandor set his feet and pulled the blade free with a sound like a boot coming loose from clay. "Come on," he said again. He was grinning now, a broken grin with blood in it. "Come on, brother. We've been walking to this since you pushed my head in as a boy." The mountain came. Sandor stepped to meet him. When the swords kissed, there was a note in that strike that made the men at the corridor's edges step back again. Not because of fear, though there was fear, but because of reverence. It is a rare thing to watch a story end exactly where it must. The last cut was not clever. It was not precise. It was not one a maester would diagram. Sandor put everything he had into it. His hatred, yes, but also that odd little love that is the twin of hatred and grows in the same soil. He put his childhood in, and every curse and every sunburn and the laughing he had done with a small wolf girl and the way ale tastes at the end of the day. He put his life in. The blade crashed into the side of the helm, under the rivets, where the metal had been weakened by a dozen dents. For a heartbeat it stuck there, half in, half out, like a nail that will not go and will not come. Sandor planted his shattered left arm against the mountain's chest and pushed. Something gave with a sound that would have made a kinderman sorry. The helm split. It did not fall. It opened, begrudging. Sandor saw what was inside and did not scream. It was a face as a child draws one when the child has only a memory of men and uses it badly. The skin had been stretched and then let go and forgotten, and now it lay where gravity pleased. The eyes were yellow around the black. Not the yellow of a cat, but the yellow of a man who had too much in him that should have been out. The mouth was wrong. It looked as if it had been cut and stitched and cut again by hands that had not learned their work. Sandor had thought he would smell rot. What he smelled was nothing. It was as if the air did not claim the thing within. "I know you," he said to that knot-face, which was a mercy, because if he had said "I don't," it would have been a lie, and this was a fight that should not end in a lie. The mountain's hands found him and closed. Sandor saw the world shrink to two eyes and a blackness spreading from the edges. He had one more trick, and he used it. He let himself go limp. Sometimes, when you are caught, you have to be caught properly. The grip loosened a hair. Enough. He brought his sword up, not far, just far enough to find the throat, which was protected by a gorget that had once shone and now dulled. He found the seam where knife had gone before, hit it again harder and felt the blade bite. He pushed with a sound that was not a word. The steel went in not far enough and then far enough. There was a gush of that black, thick not blood, and it did not hiss or steam or do any theatrical thing. Poured as if from a stopped jar. The hands opened. The mountain stood a heartbeat longer, like a joke waiting for a laugh. Then he went to his knees. Sandor staggered back, because he had learned that even a falling man can take you with him. He leaned against the wall. The stone was cold through his mail. It steadied him more than any priest could have. He watched his brother sway like a felled tree that will not choose a direction. That huge hand lifted once, as if to find a neck to wring, and then dropped. The body did not so much fall as release itself from standing. The floor shook. Dust rose and hung in the lantern light like confetti at a wedding where everyone had come to see a divorce. He waited. Men had been fooled by bodies before. He counted to a number he did not know he knew, and when he was done, the thing on the floor had not moved. He pushed himself away from the wall and came forward. He reached out a hand and stopped it an inch from the ruined flesh, then put it down on the chest plate instead and held it there. He felt no breath. That did not mean anything. Perhaps breath no longer meant anything to his brother. He held his hand anyway. The iron was cooling. "So," he said. He took his hand away. He sat down. He did it carelessly, knowing that if he fell, he might not be able to get up. He would let these men lift him, then. He would let them, for once. That's done. He looked at Qyburn's bent figure, the frail patience of the man's posture broken finally by brick. That's done, too. A movement on the edge of his eye. Arya, at last, her small face the color of thoughtful winter, her eyes bright because they had learned to be. She did not come near. She did not need to. She nodded to him once, and he felt the nod like a hand steadying a glass of water. "Go on," he said, and tried to wave but decided his arm was not an arm anymore and let it lie. "You've got other names to chase." "I'm done with names," she said. The voice had ice in it and a river. "For today." "Good," he said. "They don't keep well." Afterward there were quiets in the city that lasted minutes and were precious like coins you keep in a hidden pocket and take out to look at when the room is dark. The mountain's body was burned, not for fear it would rise, though a few men found their lips forming the old prayers as the smoke took it, but because it felt right that whatever Qyburn had done should end in a clean fire that had learned manners. Qyburn was buried in a corner of the royal ground with no marker, which was also a kind of marker. The first rumor that he walked at night started within the week and did more good than any speech. Boys stopped playing with frogs the way they had. Men with ideas about cutting into the dead for knowledge set their knives down and picked up small hammers to fix shutters instead. The Golden Company stood outside the city like a forgotten fancy cape you cannot decide whether to wear or sell. Strickland came under a white flag, pretty as a pomegranate in his Volantine silks, his beard scented with cloves. He had been hired to be the sharp end of a lie. He had not imagined he would be called to negotiate the truth. He stood before the new hand of the king and blinked at Tyrion with a decent courtesy. "Our contract was with the crown," he said. "I see crowns have multiplied." "Crowns do that sometimes," Tyrion said blandly. "We will honor the crown and more importantly the realm. You will be paid to go away." "We were paid to come," Strickland said mildly. "Perhaps you might pay us to stay and then pay us again to go, and then we will leave feeling as if we have been 3 times honored." "We will pay you once," Bronn said, before Tyrion could polish a sentence. "Half now. Half when your ships are pointed east. Not a moment later." Strickland smiled with all the warmth of a gentleman who had spent much time at sea learning to tell a gull from a guide. "Master? Coin," Bronn said. Strickland's eyebrows made a small, real movement. "Ah, yes, of course." He turned his head to take in the great slate of the city walls, the bustling men below, the archers who did not smile and did not try not to smile. "Do you intend to keep the scorpions?" "We intend to cut them for scrap," Tyrion said, "and make plows." "That is a pity," Strickland sighed. "It is always a pity when art is destroyed to make utility. Alas." He bowed perfectly. "We will take thank you for a payment." The Iron Bank sent a man with hands that had never been cold and eyes that had never been surprised. He delivered his threat like poetry. "The crown is in arrears," he announced to the small council one morning in a room that had been aired so thoroughly that it smelled only of the faint lemon oil the servants used. "The crown has always been in arrears," Tyrion said. "It is what crowns do." "We would prefer to change that habit," the representative said. "We will," Bronn said cheerfully. "We'll start by not buying new crowns." Davos did not bother with joke or jab. "We'll put men to work," he said. "We'll pull the wildfire caches out of the city and bottle it properly if you like it for war, or we'll float it out to sea and let the waves swallow it if you prefer the smell of peace. We'll clear the rubble of the streets and build drains and proper quays. We'll make a road to Duskendale that doesn't mire a cart after one rain. Tax us a little on each ship that docks and you'll get your coin the honest way, slow and constant, not squeezed out of a dry ly, out of a poor woman's pocket." "Slow is not a word our investors enjoy," the Braavosi said. "Then call it inevitable," Tyrion said, with a smile that could have been kind if it were not so tired. "There's profit in inevitabilities. Less glory, more coin." The Iron Bank man regarded him as one might regard a dish unexpectedly edible. "Very well," he said. "We will restructure your debt." Bronn leaned forward, eyes bright. "Does that mean less?" "It means," the Braavosi said, "that when you fail to pay again, the failure will be arranged." "Fair enough," Tyrion said cheerfully. "We will try to find amusing new ways to disappoint you." The small council gathered and gathered. It is what councils do. Brienne of Tarth came in armor that had been polished not to glitter but because she respected things that should be cared for. Podrick stood behind her in white, his face now wearing a man's calm where a boy's wonder had been. Samwell Tarly came with parchment and an ink-stained forefinger, his hair still refusing to choose a direction. Varys flowed in and took no seat, because he liked to be able to move, and Bran was wheeled in by a quiet boy whose name Tyrion had learned on purpose because names are the cheapest currency of respect. "We have wildfire under the city still," Davos said. "Not as much as there might have been if the dragon had done what dragons do, but enough to make a feast of the wrong street. We should send men who know how to treat it." "We should send men who do not love fireworks, then," Bronn said and yawned. "Send the men from the Alchemists' Guild who didn't. Run the last time a candle guttered," Brienne suggested. and a mummer or two, to frighten the boys who lurk at the corners into going home. I can ensure rumors do the rest, Varys said. There are men who will stay away if we tell them the right ghost lives down there, and men who will go if we tell them a different one. We will tell them both and trust the balance. Bran turned his head slightly. You're too clever to be a spymaster and not clever enough, he said to Varys, and Varys smiled with real pleasure, as if a child had finally told him the right truth. And on the matter of the queen in the tower, Sansa's letter said, read aloud by Tyrion because he had asked and she had known he would, I ask that she be kept warm, fed, and kept from ravens, for I do not trust what she will do with a quill. The room chuckled. Tyrion did not. He saw the hard line of care that ran under Sansa's words and respected it. He had learned to. Brienne took the letter after and read it again later, in the barracks when the noise of men sleeping had leveled. She did not know why she read it twice. Perhaps because in the words she could hear Sansa's voice, and in Sansa's voice she could hear the girl she had vowed to protect and had, and the woman she could not protect because she had promised herself other things. She thought of Jaime then, as she still did. She wrote a letter of her own that said nothing like what she felt and sent it by a boy whose hands were careful. In the tower, Jaime read Sansa's letter to Cersei. She had always liked the sound of a man reading, and Cersei rolled the stem of her cup between her fingers and said, She thinks she has me where she wants me. She wants you where you are, Jaime said. His voice was the voice he kept for when he spoke to horses and a few women. I do too. He set the cup down and took her hand because it was the one thing he knew how to do without making it worse. Eat, he said. You're not eating. She ate because his hand stayed on hers. Later, when the child did not become a child, she bled in a way that was both too much and not enough. She did not weep. She did not curse the gods, who had nodded at her and turned away so often she had stopped baiting them for entertainment. She lay with her face turned toward the window, and when Jaime came to sit, she said, I wanted a thing I had destroyed. Many of us do, he said. He touched her hair and felt that old warm ache in his chest that had for years been an arrow and now had softened into a bruise. The hound's wounds healed the way a dog's do, grudgingly and with a lot of sleeping. He drank in moderation because the woman who changed his dressings slapped his hand the first time he reached beyond the allowed. She was older than sand and had the mercy you find in women who have stopped waiting for men to be good. You beat him, she said, as if she were telling him the weather. I didn't beat him, Sandor said. I killed him. Same thing when it's a brother, she said. Now hold still. You'll be stiff for the winter and soft for the summer. You'll be unhappy both ways. He said, and did as he was told, because he had discovered he liked being told by people who had earned it. Arya slept on a ship with a small crew and a captain who had a face like a map. Too many lines to read all at once. They sailed west into an ocean that had the patience of a god and the temper too. The first storms taught them humility so thorough it felt like a different kind of baptism. Arya learned the new names of waves. The sailors had a dozen, and then another dozen they only used when drunk. She learned to tie and untie knots with her eyes closed and her hands cold. She learned that the sea is a place where killing does you little good, and so she stilled her hand and let other knives do their work. Days came when there was nothing on every side and the emptiness put its hand up under her ribs and squeezed. She found herself smiling into it. When a school of fish glittered near, the captain shouted and laughed and the men hauled lines and she hauled with them. Sometimes the sea gave them nothing and the stew was thinner and the jokes were louder. She thought of Gendry then, hammering in a hall with stone for a dome, and was glad she had left him to find his own heat. She lay at night under a sail turned into a tent and said the names of her family under her breath. Sansa, Bran, Jon. She added others sometimes, then stopped herself, not from sadness but because she wanted the list to be short and true. They sighted a strip of land months out where no map had been certain. It was not large. It looked like the back of a sleeping animal. It had trees unlike any Arya had seen, their leaves long and narrow like knives for delicate work. The people who lived there were not surprised to see the ship so much as indifferent. They had seen storms, and storms brought worse. They traded fish with the sailors and copper with faces and a kind of bread that tasted of salt and sun. Arya went ashore and walked far enough to feel the island hold under her feet, then went back to the boat. She did not leave a mark. Not every place must be scratched with your name. She saw, far further west, a white curve on the horizon and then nothing, and she thought she understood something. That some roads end not because there is no more road but because the feet walking have become more interested in turning than continuing. She turned north, found an island of black rock where birds nested and men took their eggs, and she went ashore to see the birds up close. One pecked her ear until it bled, and she laughed like a girl being chased by a puppy. She stitched the ear clumsily and thought of the girl she had once been, and found she did not miss her. She had given the girl what she owed: knives, a path through a dark wood, a clear sky to look at. Grey Worm learned Noth the hard way, which is to say the right way. The first Aites, men who had survived 1,000 spears, were taken by fevers that came with the dark like an unwelcome guest and brought sweetness to the air that made the nose think of orchards before it thought of death. They burned, then cooled, then burned again. Their eyes grew too bright. They muttered in languages they had never learned. They died with dignity because that was their habit. Grey Worm buried them with his own hands. The peaceful people came, faces open and unafraid, and showed him how to smear oil pressed from a plant that grew where the trees met the sand, and how to light smoky fires at sundown, and how to sing low tunes that somehow made the air less friendly to the things that bit. He moved his camps to the small rocky islets 2 arrow flights from shore. The water between was a moat made by gods who did not like blood. They built huts there out of driftwood and ingenuity. They learned to listen for the particular hum that meant danger and to keep their ankles in the surf at sunset. They died less often. Some of them married Nothy women and learned to pound palms into mats and to eat a kind of fruit that made the mouth feel full of flowers. When Grey Worm closed his eyes, he sometimes heard bells in a city far away, and sometimes he heard Missandei's voice say a word that meant endure, in a tongue this place had given her. He did both. Letters went from capital to capital, from keeps to keeps, under seals with familiar buckles and wolves and fish and stags. Those stags were new again and had not yet decided how to hold their heads in wax. Gendry wrote to Arya, his hand large and honest on the parchment, telling her that Storm's End had more wind than a man should have to endure and that hammers sounded odd under a round roof. He told her about a girl with hair like flax who flirted with him out of sheer habit, and a boy with 2 teeth who could lift more than a grown man, and a dog who had decided he liked Gendry because Gendry scratched behind his ears the same way every time. He did not ask her to come back. He told her he would be there if she did. Arya wrote back with a picture, a bad one, of a fish she had seen that looked like a knife and a star put together. She told him as little as possible and everything at once. She told him she was well. It was true enough. Sansa wrote to Tyrion and Tyrion to Sansa with a warmth that had learned its own boundaries and did not need more. He told her of the way the market had begun to fill again, and of a woman who slapped a man for taking too many onions, and of a boy who had learned to juggle 3 apples and then dropped them and then learned to juggle 3 stones and kept the apples for eating. She told him of a flock of white birds that had landed on the lake by Winterfell and stayed a week as if they had forgotten the time. She told him of the earnestness with which the Manderleys argued about fish. They made each other laugh on purpose. That is a rare thing for people who have been to war with themselves. Edmure Tully fumbled a little as a lord and learned not to mind the laughter. He married again, quietly, and stopped trying to teach his new wife to shoot and began instead to let her show him how to boil fish properly. Jon Royce kept the veil still, like a hand steadying water. Gendry went once to the capital and sat on the small council bench like a boy who had cleaned himself up and put on his father's jacket and found that it fits in the shoulders if you keep your shoulders right. Bronn counted coin with a glint that sometimes looked like violence and sometimes looked like charm. It was probably both. Sam wrote a book he did not call A Song of Ice and Fire because he was not a poet but a cataloger. He called it Seasons and Sentences and kept a list of the names of all the children he met in the streets and wrote a line about each one in the back. Bran asked after Drogon once in council, not aloud but with a turn of his head that made Tyrion think of ravens shifting on a branch. After the meeting, in a garden where the lemon trees had begun to believe in themselves again, Tyrion took the wheels of Bran's chair and asked, lightly as he could, "Do you ever look for him?" "Sometimes," Bran said. His voice did not have the echo it once had. Sounded more like a boy and less like a winter. He is far. He is not angry. Do you see where? Tyrion said. He did not expect an answer. A warm place, Bran said, where men talk to red priests as if they were neighbors. He eats when he wants and sleeps when he wants. He remembers her. He knows no one else. He will not come back. That is good, Tyrion said. The city is damp enough without a dragon drying it for us. He thought of Daenerys then, as he always did. As a woman he had tried to save from the worst thing inside her and had failed. Thank you, he told Bran. And Bran looked at him with that odd, grave comprehension that made Tyrion feel both comforted and exposed. News came out of Dorne fitfully, because Dorne had always preferred to be a rumor. The prince or princess of Dorne, some said a new Nymeria, some a man with a name like a wind, sent an envoy with skin the color of late summer and a gleam in his eye that suggested he had been sent because he enjoyed watching northerners pretend not to sweat. He brought pomegranates and a promise that there would be no war as long as there was wine. Tyrion raised a cup and thought that this, too, was governance. There were a few bad days. There always are. A knot of Lannister loyalists in the city. Men who had once served at the edges and never lost the taste of swagger, got drunk on memory and tried to break the queen from her tower. They made it as far as the base of the stairs. Jaime stood at the top, unarmed and unarmored, and said, "No further." In a voice that remembered how to command. They went further. Brienne's sword sang once, twice. She used the flat when she could and the edge when she had to. For Mendi, it, too limped. One cried. Jaime put a hand on the banister afterward and closed his eyes, as a man might touch a tree that has stood forever and take comfort from its refusal to fall. The city dreamed of dragons sometimes. In the dreams, they were not burned but warmed. In the mornings, women gossiped about whether a dragon's shadow would make your seed fail, and men argued about whether a dragon's heat would make bread rise better without a hearth. Children drew dragons in dust and on doors and were scolded for it and drew them again. It is hard to remove a shape from a city's mind once it has nested there. Jon went deeper north with Tormund until the world changed how it spoke. South of the wall, the wind had words for men and for women and for roofs. North of it, it had words for rocks and for ice and for old bones under snow. He learned them by listening. The free folk made a home in a valley where the wind could be persuaded to break against a ridge and leave a pocket of leniency for smoke to rise and not be hammered flat. They built with what the land offered. Bones of the dead giants that had wandered here and lain down finally because they were tired. Stones with lichen thick enough to serve as a thin blanket. Saplings that found soil where the thaw had licked. Jon learned to knot hides with fingers that had once been made clumsy by gloves and now grew deft again. He learned to cut a hole in ice without cutting too deep. He learned to do nothing, which is a skill a king or a fool never learns. Once in a while a white owl perched on the peak of a hut and watched him. He watched it back. It didn't feel like his brother. There was no stare warmth, no seeing. But sometimes it tipped its head just so, and he tipped his, and he laughed to himself when he did it because he knew it looked absurd. Ghost came and went as he pleased. He never went far. At night Jon sometimes woke to a weight pressed against his legs, a warmth, and he put his hand on the wolf's ribs and felt the animal's casual, lordly breath. There were women in that place who would have had Jon in their bed out of curiosity or necessity or because they had eyes. He did not go. He did not promise anything to anyone, including himself. Felt to him like a kind of fidelity. One winter that came late brought with it a thing old Nan had told stories about. Snow bears that came down from the farther north and hunted not from hunger but because it was their way. They were larger than the men from the south believed, and quieter. One took a child from the edges of the camp and Jon found the mother screaming at a tree, because the tree could take it and no one else could. He tracked the bear. He went with Tormund and 2 others. He found the place where the bear had eaten. He killed the bear with a spear he had helped cut and set. He sat beside the dead thing afterward and put his hand on its body that was losing heat and said, "We took what you took," and felt no better, and that was appropriate. They buried what they could bury and burned what they could not, and took the ashes to the wind because the wind had always been a better priest than any man. Tormund took to telling the story in the exact same way every time, with flourishes Jon did not remember. He looked the bear in the eye, Tormund would start. And the bear said, "You're thin," and Snow said, "I said nothing." Jon would say every time, "I've got enough," Tormund finished smugly. And then he stabbed it in the eye. "I stabbed it in the chest," Jon would say. "In the chest, in the eye, who listens?" Tormund would counter. "The point is, you see a bear, you go find Jon Snow, he'll go talk poetry to it. Stories are all we leave." Jon let this one walk. In King's Landing, the first new statues went up not to kings and queens, but to a woman who had given soup to 100 men, and to a mason who had built a stair that did not break under the weight of food being carried. It was a fashion for a time, and then it became a habit. Tyrion stood beneath one of them once. Just a stone woman with her ladle, and felt like crying and did not. He went home and wrote a law in the lazy, precise hand he had made as a boy that said every ward should have a street where no wagons could go and where children could run and not have their necks broken. He brought it to the council and Brienne said, "Yes," and Bronn said, "How much will it cost?" And Davos said, "We can do it with men who need work," and Varys said, "We will need to make sure the brothels don't open there because they like quiet streets." And Sam said, "I'll write about it," and Bran said, "Do it," and so it was done. Cersei in her tower did not wither the way some had wished and some had feared. She learned a new kind of quiet. She let a seamstress in and wore dresses that were easy to put on with one hand and did not bind. She gave her attendants nicknames, not unkind ones. She permitted Jaime to read to her and sometimes she read to him. She did not ask about the city. Sometimes, when the bells rang for a wedding or a birth, she pressed the heels of her hands hard to her ears until the skin whitened, and then she took them away. On a day of high sun she asked for a lemon cake and ate it with a little sigh. Jaime watched her and he could not have said if the sigh was for the taste or for some memory of a taste. Brienne came once. She stood in the doorway as if the room were a court where she must wait to be called. Cersei regarded her with a curiosity that had been honed to a knife's narrowness, and then set down because it had made too many men bleed. "Did you come to parade your kindness in front of me?" she asked. "I came to see if you wanted anything," Brienne said. "A way out," Cersei said sweetly. "Anything else?" Brienne said, with no rise in her voice, as if she were keeping a carriage steady over rocks. Cersei thought. "A book," she said at last. "Something with a woman in it who does not get herself for a man." Brienne returned with a romance from the south and a history from the north and set them down and left without remark. Cersei read both and returned the northern one and kept the southern. "No one changes for the better," she told Jaime when he asked what she thought. "They only become who they would have been if the world had let them." "Sometimes the world lets you," he said softly. She did not answer. He did not expect her to. Years wearing the shape of peace stretched and snapped back from time to time, as if to test their elasticity. A spring brought blight to the riverlands and Sansa sent grain south on riverboats that had been used to carry soldiers and now learned to carry bread. The same year, a hot, short temper ran through the Dothraki still in the reach like a cough. They drank too much. They broke a house's gate. They were contained by firelight and discussion and the offer to go east with an Iron Fleet ship. Yara did that because she had promised and because she was bored. She took 100 with her. They sang badly. Sam, who had set up his school under a tree in a corner of the city where the air was always a little cooler, wrote a letter to Sansa. "We have taught 10 boys to read who never would have. We have taught 4 girls. The girls were better at it. I told them to tell their brothers so they would be ashamed." Sansa wrote back, "Teach them sums as well. We need merchants as much as maesters." He smiled at that and drew a silly picture of a fish with a crown and sent it with the next message. Bran's rule grew not easier but steadier. He did not have the talent for spectacle. People came to him with matters small and enormous. He had a way of listening that made some angry because it made them hear themselves. He had a way of answering that satisfied no one entirely, which usually means you have done something close to right. When a man came to claim a plot of land where his father had stolen a wagon and been hanged for it, Bran said, "Plant a tree there and leave it for anyone to sit under and no one to own." And the man went away feeling as if he had been cheated, and then, after a few years of seeing lovers kiss there and old men nod in sleep there and children fall and cry there and be comforted, felt as if he had been paid a kindness he had not asked for and would not know how to repay. Tyrion drank less. He still drank, because drinking was a friend that had been kind to him when men had not. He hid his wine less often and hid nothing else. When he walked in the streets, some men shouted his name and some spat and some made jokes they thought he had not heard before. He replied to what he pleased and ignored the rest. He took a lover for a while, a woman who had been a singer before the war broke her voice and who had learned to teach others to sing. He loved her as much as he could, which is sometimes less than you mean. She left him without bitterness because he had not betrayed her, only himself. She told him to learn a song he could sing alone, and he learned 3 and sang them badly. Once, after a rain, he went to the yard where a few young men and women were being taught to bow properly to the king. Brienne was there, patient as a stone and with more sense. Podrick corrected a boy's grip with the ease that comes from wearing a uniform until you forget it's there. A girl in the line banged the base of her spear on the ground at the wrong moment and looked mortified. Tyrion said, "I know the feeling." And she cracked a shy smile and had better timing the next strike. Jon came south once, not to the city but to the border of the land that had once been a border and was now just a place where one kind of snow turned into another kind of field. He met Sansa under the same sky they had always shared. She wore a cloak that had a pattern in it a southern seamstress would have missed, a story of wolves woven between thicker threads. He was thinner and stronger than when she'd last seen him, and his hair had gone a little wild, as if it had learned from the wind and given up on manners. "You're well," she said. "I am," he said. He looked at her crown for a long, quiet moment, then at her face. "It suits you." "It is heavy," she said. "It is lighter than some things," he said. They walked together by a stream that had always been there. She told him of people and their complicated, faithful foibles, of Lord Glover and his oak-strong decency, of the Mormont cousins who had learned to fight like their aunt and teased one another like fishwives. He told her of a boy who had learned to make a whistle from birch and had taught a girl, and how the girl could call a fox from a copse as if she were its mother. They stood side by side and did not pretend they were not thinking of their father and their mother and a house that had stood and would stand, and of a world that took and gave and took again. When they parted, she squeezed his hand hard, to make sure he could feel it through the glove. "Tell Arya," she said. "I will if she stops somewhere long enough to be told," he said, and it was a joy to them both to be able to laugh like that. He did not go to the capital. He was wise enough to know peace when he felt it and not to meddle with it. He went back north and taught a boy to set a snare that would not take a wolf by mistake, and let a woman teach him to mend a boot better than he had learned at the wall, and watched as ghosts chased something only ghosts could see and then returned satisfied. On a night of the sort men like to tell others about, clear stars as stupidly numerous as they always are and only we are ever surprised, he looked up and felt small in a good way. In a chamber with a long table and a dozen chairs, Tyrion once held up a cup and said, "To the bells." And Bronn made a noise at the back of his throat like a man who thinks a tooth is about to go and wants to get it done. "To the bells?" he said. "Yes, Tyrion S. To the bells." To a thin, frightened sound that made men stay their hands for once. To the people who heard it and believed. To a city that, instead of learning to scream louder, learned to listen better. "You're getting pious," Bronn said. "I am getting old," Tyrion replied, "which is a kind of piety." Drink. They did. They did not drink to kings. They did not drink to dragons. They drank to small things that had grown to fit them. To a cobbler who made a boot that did not pinch. To a woman who scolded a lord and was not hanged for it. To a child who learned to read and then to lie better because of it. To a day when the wind did not change and 1,000 men did not die. A raven came one early spring to Winterfell with ink hardly dry, and Sansa read it and laughed aloud. It was from Arya and said only, "I found a place where the sun looks wrong. Tell Jon I am still not married." Sansa sent back, "We did not expect you to be." And then, because she had learned that you do not waste small chances, she added, "Be well, little sister." She thought of the way Arya's hand had been light on a blade and heavy on a heart, and went to the godswood and thanked the old and the new gods both. because she was generous when she could be. In Noth, Grey Worm stood with his feet in the water and watched the horizon. The sunsets there had a habit of making even a soldier's chest ache. A child ran past, laughing, his hair long and black, his stride the careless bounce of those who have never been marched. The boy's mother called after him in that soft language, and he came back grudgingly, because children are the same on every shore. Grey Worm felt the pull that would have once been to drill and now was to stillness. He let it pull. He found that Missandei's voice had faded and become not a call but a presence. He was not done mourning her. He imagined he never would be. He found that an acceptable fate. On a morning much like another, with gulls insolent and the smell of low tide honest, a woman in King's Landing who had once been a beggar made a stew that did not taste of smoke or of desperation. It tasted of onions and herbs and a bit of fat a butcher had given her because her boy had carried a message for him. She put the bowl in front of the boy and he ate it with the solemnity of altar bread. She looked out her window because she had a window now, to where the street ran and people walked and did not run, and she put her knuckles to her mouth and bit down lightly because that is what you do to keep a cry from coming when you don't know if it is a good cry or bad. In the Red Keep, where tapestries had been cleaned and hung to hide scars too stubborn to polish out, Bran sat in the sun and let its weight find his bones. He did not feel triumphant. He felt useful. Tyrion came and stood a moment without speaking, which is a thing he had learned. Bran turned his head. Just enough. "The city is loud," Bran said. "It is," Tyrion said. "You hear it too, then?" "I hear it," Bran said. "I hear the sea in it again." "Good," Tyrion said softly. "Good." They sat together like that a while, the king and his hand, two men who had had too much of the worst and were doing their poor best to nest the world back into itself. They did not talk of philosophies or of prophecies or of flames. They talked about drains that needed mending and the choice of a better roof for the orphanage and whether there should be a law about men who kept pigs in their yards when they lived too near bakeries. The sun moved and their shadows with it, dutiful as servants, and below them the city lifted its wash and its prayers and its curses and its jokes to the sky. One night, deep north, Jon woke to a noise that was not a noise. He went outside and found the world lit thinly by a moon that would not commit and heard geese arguing their way across the sky. He laughed at them for their bickering and they didn't care because geese never do. He felt a warmth in his chest then, unexpected and undeserved, and put his hand there as if it were an ache. It passed, as feelings do, and he was glad it had been. He went back inside and lay down again and ghost-sighed in his sleep like a man who had finally been given a decent pillow. Jon watched the fire die properly and did not stir it. The night did not need to be turned into day. In his dreams, he stood in the hall at Dragonstone again, and she stood before him with her hair like unspooled moonlight and her gaze a blade and a bomb. She did not speak. Neither did he. They stood a long time like that, in the old hall where the map had run down the walls and left new rivers of cooled stone in its place. She put a hand up as if to touch his face and he woke before she could. He did not try to go back to the dream. He lay awake and watched the wall go from black to gray and listened to the slow breath of the sleeping place and thought, "This is life." No bards wrote songs about the bells afterward, not because the bells did not deserve them, but because the bells were a sound that did not ask for ornament. Mothers told their children that it had been the bells that saved them, and the children rolled their eyes and wanted dragons in the story. The mothers told them dragons were a lie and a truth both, and the children went to sleep imagining bells with wings. When the time came, as it comes for all men, for someone to go to Jon and give him news from south or north that mattered enough to break the ordinariness of a day, Tormund did it because he knew how to do it with a grin that made anything sound survivable. "They want us to come down, little crow," he said. "They're going to make a feast for some reason to do with a road that no one will remember. I promised them we'd piss in their road, so they'd remember us properly." "I'll go," Jon said, and he did. And he stood at the edge of a crowd that cheered for a speech about drains, and he laughed to himself because he had come to love a RLD where drains were worth cheering. Sansa saw him from the platform and did not call him up. She knew he would hate it. She came down to him after, and they ate bread together standing by a cart, and no one made much of it because the world had learned, for a while at least, that the best things are the ones you do not make much of. On the far side of the world, a dragon flew over a temple where men lit fires they said contained gods, and the dragon did not care. He slept on black stone warmed from below by old anger, and he dreamed of a woman's hand and a man's stillness and woke to eat and to fly and to be. He saw ships sometimes and did not burn them. Sometimes he turned his head and looked west for a long time and then turned away again. He was, as men so rarely are, enough for himself. In a tower in King's Landing, Cersei watched a bird land on the sill and tilt its head like a gossip. She did not show it the back of her hand. She said, "Well?" to it, because old habits make strange friends, and it said nothing because it was a bird and birds have better things to do than answer women in towers. She smiled, a real smile that used muscles she had not employed in a little while, and ate a piece of pear, and thought of nothing at all. It was pleasant. Tyrion walked home late one evening and saw a pair of boys fighting half-heartedly in an alley, fists slapping rather than striking, and a girl standing by with her arms folded judging both of them and finding them wanting. He stopped, leaned on his cane and watched, and when the boys had exhausted themselves, he said, "Now shake hands." In a tone that made it briefly a law, they did sullenly. The girl snorted and then laughed, despite herself. A door opened down the alley. A woman's voice scolded in the nightly liturgy of a city. Tyrion resumed walking. The moon floated above the rooftops like a coin a god had flicked and forgotten. He did not wish for more than this. He had learned. At the wall that was no longer a wall and yet remained the wall, a boy from White Harbor came with eyes wide and questions wider, and Jon taught him to close his mouth when he wasn't using it, and to tie a scarf so that it would not come loose and choke him, and to listen for the kind of silence that means something is wrong. The boy learned quickly and then too quickly and then slowly again, which is the way of learning. Years turned. People died and were born. There were tears and there were laughs, and there were nights when the wind made the eaves groan, and mornings when the light hit a window and made a patch on a floor so gold it felt like a blessing. And sometimes bells rang, thin or fat, frightened or merry, and people stopped what they were doing and listened, less for what the bells meant than for the reminder that there is a language beyond knives and beyond fire, and it can be learned, and then they went back to their lives, which were what the world had given them and what they had made of it. If you had stood on a roof in King's Landing on a mild day and looked out toward the sea, you would have seen ships like thoughts going and coming, and a city that had finally learned to be something more than a stage for tragedy. If you had stood at the edge of a grove north of the wall at dusk, you would have seen a man and a wolf and a giant of a man signing to one another with their bodies, making a small conversation about food and danger and the kind of contentment that does not brag. If you had climbed the winds of Noth, you would have seen men standing in the water up to their calves and singing quiet songs to the sun as it went, and you would have smelled the smoke from carefully tended fires. No one wrote that down. They did not need to. The world remembers on its own, in ways we cannot tell it not to. It remembers a woman with hair pale as wheat feeling warmth leave her and being carried by a sun that was not a sun into a night that chose to keep her. It remembers a man who killed because he loved and because he feared what love without law does to cities. It remembers a boy with eyes too old saying yes because someone had to, and a girl with a list folding it and walking west, and another girl who learned that the thing you promise yourself can be delivered. It remembers a monstrous brother falling and a man sitting back against a wall with his breath rattling and laughing because it was done. It remembers, most stubbornly, the bells. On the afternoon of a day that had no special name and wanted none, Jon walked alone to the top of a low hill that had watched 1,000 seasonal arguments between wind and grass and won none of them. He stood there and looked around as if to learn again the shape of what he had chosen. He thought, suddenly and not sadly, of Daenerys. Her face the instant before the knife, the weight of her in his arms after, the long dark of the dragon's mouth and the holy absence of heat. He thought of her not as a queen or as a fire or as a mistake made by gods, but as a person. He bowed his head, not to a god, and not to her, but to the fact of having been, which is a thing worthy of a bow. When he lifted it, the sky was the same, and that was right. He went down the hill then, to where the fire would be, and men would be arguing about whether the stew needed more salt, and women would be laughing at them because they had long since added enough salt and knew it. He went to where Ghost would be sprawled too close to the heat because he liked his fur warm, and where Tormund would be telling an obscene story badly, and where a girl whose name he had finally learned would be showing him the whistle she had carved to call foxes. He went into the ordinary evening as into a hall, the kind of hall that does not need banners because the people in it are banners enough, moving, breathing, saying one another's names correctly. And somewhere, very far away, a dragon turned in his sleep and forgot to dream and remembered Aga. In and slept on, untroubled by bells or by men, a fact so large and so simple it can only be set down once and then left alone.